Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's good to see all of you here this morning for the next event in our Spring Forum season. My guest today is Dr. Tonya Foster. She is a poet, essayist, editor, Black feminist scholar. Her writing and research focus on poetry, poetics, idea of place and emplacement, and on intersections between the visual and the written. She uses all types of words in her poetry, big and small, beautiful and vulgar. It is a key tactic of her ongoing study of language. Every year, we choose a theme to inspire us and to create new ways to grow as a community. Last year was our year of poetry. This year, we are celebrating our 175th anniversary as a congregation with the year of memory. Today, we have the opportunity to touch on both themes as we talk about poetry as memory and poetry as prayer. Tonya, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
You know, I was so moved by the invitation, and it came at a moment. I'm from New Orleans, so occasionally there's a bit of a woo-woo in me, but it came at a moment where I felt that my answer, even as I have a calendar of all kinds of things to do, my answer was immediately yes. Yeah. This, I feel compelled and called to have the conversation. So thank you, and to think about these
Yeah,
things.
exactly. I mean, we talked a little bit about poetry as prayer when we first got together this morning, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your picture of poetry and your picture of prayer and how they're connected.
Well, it's funny. I thought, okay, why am I thinking this? And the first time I sort of put that quote in my, I guess, in public space for me is that it was a response to Emerson.
Right.
Right?
I'm preaching about Emerson this morning.
Really?
Yeah, you have to stick around for it.
I'll have to
may
stick
not have time for it.
Well, Emerson, and this is the quote, and it's the end that really kind of moved me, and this is Emerson's Self-Reliance, where he says, prayer that craves a particular commodity, anything less than all good is vicious. Prayer is the contemplation of the facts of life from the highest point of view. It is the soliloquy of a beholding and jubilant soul. It is the Spirit of God pronouncing his works good. But prayer as a means to effect a private end is meanness and theft. It supposes dualism and not unity in nature and consciousness. As soon as the man is at one with God, he will not beg. He will then see prayer in all action. The prayer of the farmer kneeling in his field to weed it. The prayer of the rower kneeling with the stroke of the oar are true prayers heard throughout nature, though for cheap ends, he says. And I think the thing that sticks with me is the idea of prayer as labor.
Yeah.
Right? That the labor is also the prayer.
Right.
To achieve something in the world, and that I guess I've been thinking about, I was deeply moved by James Lawson's, his recitation of a Langston Hughes poem when he spoke at James Lewis's funeral. But also I saw a short documentary about Lawson, and he talked about the dignity of work as he as a part of his organizing principles.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think of poetry as so often there are those who want to think of poetry as somehow removed from an engagement with the world or above it. When I think of poetry as being about a kind of going down into the flesh, the mud, the labor. And that metaphors are not cheap things. They're not easy. They're not necessarily comforting. They're deeply incisive and that's the work of the poet, to pay attention. And I don't know. I mean, there are so many other things.
I was just even thinking, I hadn't thought about this in quite this way before, but, the word liturgy, which is like, what we do here basically is we produce liturgy. I mean, it's a Greek word that means like the work of the people. And so there is there's a way in which we talk about liturgy as being a kind of work. Prayer is a kind of work. We have a poet who's a member of the congregation named Atsuro Riley, and he writes. He did a retreat for us up at the Bishop's Ranch one year, and he said, poetry to the rescue. Poetry is here to help you solve problems, and that's another, explicit way of saying it's work, not just in the effort that it takes to create, but in the effect that it has.
That's right. And that it's a way of thinking, and a way of thinking outside of the regular ways of thinking. That it's not merely a representation or reflection of what we think we already know.
Right.
But that the poem that is engaged in the work is producing knowledge we have no other way of knowing.
Yeah, exactly. And what practically happened was, at the same time that Atsuro taught me this, the person who's in charge, the priest who's in charge of doing yoga practices, left, and we doubled the number of yoga practices we had.
Wow.
And so, we have like a kind of little homily before the yoga practice starts. And poetry has been an extraordinary gift to that community, so that I'm not creating every single thing myself new. And you're right, it takes us places that we didn't expect, and on a different day it might have a different kind of meaning to us. And so even yesterday when I did the poetry, anyway, the poem I did afterwards, one of the young people came up and said, I would really like that. So I gave him the poetry, and
nice.
Oh, it was a great poem. I wish I could do it by heart.
What is it?
I'm trying to remember. I'm going to remember by the time we're in this,
Memory.
Yeah. Well, I guess I could look up in my little cell phone, but that's not the way to do it. So, one of the things, as I was preparing to see you today, I think of just, all the headlines being filled with student unrest on campuses, protests about the situation in Gaza. And I just thought, you're so sweet to say that you're not an expert on this, but you really are there on the front line. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it's like in college campuses today, right now, and then also just what you noticed just about how it's portrayed in the media. Like, I often feel like when the media talks about something I really know well, I'll notice things that are just, not accurate, or, not quite right in the spirit.
Well, there are many things for me. I feel like I actually can't watch the most major news.
Yeah. Especially about this.
And part of it, there are several things that I think I notice and things I hear about, right? Some of my closest friends, I moved to the Bay Area from New York. And several of my closest friends are activists, are professors at Columbia, professors at the New School, and professors at CUNY, in the sort of CUNY thing. And there are several things. They notice that for them, for me, the students are seeing what is.
Yeah.
And that they're reacting to that. And it's interesting how the narratives that are coming out suggest that they don't know what they're talking about.
That was really upsetting to me.
Suggests that almost don't believe your lying eyes, that's sort of the line of attack and approach. And so there's not, we talked about this earlier a little bit, the deep dishonesty. Right?
Yeah.
I remember since the pandemic,
right,
and since we returned from the pandemic, I've begun each workshop with the discussion of, I say, okay, why write when the world is on fire? And so a young student, and I say young student, this is a young woman, so she's in the workshop, and she said, the world has been on fire my whole life. And I had to stop, and I said, you're absolutely right, Bitta.
Yeah.
And in fact, the world has been on fire my whole life.
Yeah.
And so what's poetry in the face of that?
Right.
Right? And so and I mentioned Bitta's response before I go on this tangent about, the poem doesn't stop the bullet.
Yeah.
But it may animate the body. It may tell the story of the bullet.
Yeah.
But so students are well aware of not only the state of things in their communities, but they imagine their communities beyond the geographical spaces they occupy.
Yeah.
And so there's something about, remember a dear friend said to me, she said, she's been with her partner, Greg, they just turned 60.
Yeah.
I won't say her name. But since she was a sophomore in
Oh my goodness.
in college.
Wow. Yeah.
And so she said, the thing about being with Greg is that the good things are twice as good. The bad things are half as bad.
Amen. That's speaking the gospel truth from my experience too. Yeah.
And so I mention this because I think about, there are several things, and my brain kind of works in
Branching patterns.
branching patterns, absolutely. I think of this quote because I've been thinking about how sometimes we remember our trauma and use our trauma as a cudgel against others, or use our trauma to draw a kind of fence around ourselves, as opposed to imagining that, well, wait, how is my grief like yours?
Right, right.
And how might we actually help each other carry our grief? And not that it will diminish the grief, but it may make it possible to bear.
Yeah.
And it also may make it possible for something else to happen.
Yeah.
And my sense of the students is that there's a desire for that, and there's frustration that can't. There seem to be all these ways of stopping the engagement and enactment of that in the world.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. We were talking a little bit earlier about just the importance of being honest, and I think that's something that I hear from the young students who, I keep saying young students, anybody who's under the age of 30 for me. But talking to students, that's what I get from them is a sense of just of wanting to speak honestly. And I think that's part of what feels so different about these protests for me than like in other times, where I almost feel like the protesters are almost made out to be anti-Semitic when they're peace activists. Mm-hmm. Whereas at least, if you're protesting the Vietnam War and you were a peace activist, no one said that you're really kind of this other awful thing, Well,
it's true, and I feel like it's been a long, there've been sort of study in how to defeat, dismiss, dissent, actually. So that I remember I was in New York during 9/11. I remember that morning just so clearly.
Yeah.
It's like burned into my brain. One, because the sky was beautiful.
Yeah.
It was gorgeous. And I was living in Harlem. And I remember my cousin called from Atlanta. She's like, "Tonya, where are you?" And I'm like, I'm in my house. Yeah. And so she said a plane ran into the
World Trade Center.
World Trade Center. And I turned on the TV and I said, well, that could not have been an accident. And she goes, why? I said, because the skies are crystal clear.
Yeah, right.
And so after that, I just remember the tens of thousands of people in the streets.
Yeah.
I was one of them saying, don't do this in our name.
Yeah.
No more death in our name.
Yes.
And there were people who were enraged, furious at us because there had been the kind of, ramp up to war,
Yeah.
the vilification of people, the creation of the narrative.
Right, that anti-Muslim
That's right.
rhetoric, it was terrible.
That would say, this is okay.
Yeah.
And so we see that exact same thing happening now.
Yeah.
We also see, thinking about, oddly, I'm thinking about the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
And I think about the vilification of poor people.
Yes, totally.
Right?
Oh, I completely remember that. Right, crack mothers and things. Was that
That's
what they
right.
called it?
Or
you're
welfare-
right.
welfare queens.
Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. And so this sort of use of language to create a narrative, to create an image that allows anything to take place,
Yeah.
that allows what is essentially kind of dehumanizing, just so many practices, that language is amazing. And we can go back to, I think of Orwell.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Completely. 1984.
1984, and Orwell writing about the ways that language gets manipulated so that we don't see reality.
Yeah, exactly.
That there's something
this is
in
something
front
that's
of
so
us.
interesting to me, too. I guess it's because I'm getting old enough to see how things change in my life. Before I just didn't have that. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how language is changing. There's definitely, technology is changing it. There's cultural movements like hip hop that's changing it. There's justice reasons for language to change, too. And I wonder if you can just talk about what you've seen in terms of like how language is changing over time.
Well, I can try to speak to that. I think something has changed recently in my own writing, what I realize. And in order to explain it, I'll talk a little bit about how I became a poet.
Yeah, I would love to hear that. Those are the questions I was asking further down. But yeah, how did you become a poet?
My mother read to me as a girl. She read to me all the frickin' time.
That's great. I love that.
And so as a little kid, I had books all the time.
Yeah.
And so I was reading all the time. And my church, I was a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church,
right.
where I was baptized, and then Stronger Hope Baptist Church. And so I would have to read things.
Right.
And then as a kid in school, the teachers went on strike when I was in 6th grade.
Yeah.
And one of my best friends was the librarian, Ms. Monet. And so Ms. Monet used to feed me books.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, well, this is outrageous. And I wrote a poem that was published in the Louisiana Weekly.
Love that. Oh my gosh, your first poem was published.
I know, it's really wacky, actually.
Yeah. And it was a protest poem.
And it was a protest poem.
Yeah. Wow.
And so there was that. But then I went to, when I was in 6th grade, Mr. Midkiff said, when I was in 6th grade, Mr. Midkiff said, you're overly dramatic. We want to send you should go to NOCA, which was the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts.
Yeah.
And they said, no, you're not an actor. So
Mr. Midkiff thought you were too dramatic. They thought you were not dramatic.
You're not dramatic. You're not an actor. But I tried again for NOCA in the 10th grade in writing. Uh-huh. And I got into NOCA. But it was fantastic in terms of exposure. I would listen to music under Ellis Marcellus's tutelage in order to learn to write about music.
Yeah.
I read widely, But I can honestly say there was very little literature by Black writers.
Yeah.
All of the Black arts writers that I was reading before were not on the curricula.
Yeah.
And so, so I remember thinking, I can't write the kind of poetry they want me to write. My prose was fierce.
Yeah.
But then I was obsessed with the surrealists, right?
Yeah.
I loved Dorothea Tanning's work.
Right.
And so my first, right,
Yeah,
and so in the back of the
exactly.
book.
I'm so glad you include the picture, because when I looked it up on the internet, the picture, I just didn't have this. But yeah, this image right here.
Right, which is a Max Ernst.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just fall into this work. And so the first poem I wrote was Ode to Guardian Angels, which is a painting by Dorothea Tanning. And so but I still struggled with what was called poetry in those spaces. I got an MFA, sort of because I couldn't figure out what to do when the tall boy I loved joined the Peace Corps, and I thought, I'm not going to the Peace Corps with you, bro.
Yeah.
So I went and I got this MFA, and then I moved to New York, and I spent time in New York just kind of wandering in a weird way. I would go to the 92nd Street Y, I would go to Shakespeare and Company, and I would just listen.
Yeah.
I would go to the Bowery Poetry Club, so these very different sort of fields of poetry. And I have a dear friend whom I met in college, and her father, there's a service for him today in New York.
Yeah.
He was a master printer and painter, and she's a brilliant poet. But she would say, Tonya, what are you working on?
Yeah, I love that.
I'm like,
Great
I don't know,
question.
have a job. Like, and she would invite me to read.
Yeah.
And so that was significant in a way that for me, poetry was possible because of community.
Yeah.
Right? And building community. And so there were just people around who were always saying, what are you writing? What are you thinking about? And so then I almost died, and
Oh my gosh, I'm glad you're okay.
I'm glad I didn't die too.
Yeah.
That was very dramatic.
Yeah.
But after that, I thought, okay, just write what you write.
Yeah.
And so what I'm writing now, I recognize in terms of the formal constraints that it's much more fragmented, that it's questioning form in the middle.
Yeah, that's one of the things I had to ask you about. So I remember the name of the poet, Lucille Clifton. Mm-hmm. And it's like of waves or of water, or, you know, it just kept coming to me. And like your work, I mean, so she doesn't use capitalization, punctuation, and it really advances your experience of the work. For me, it helps me to be just fully immersed in it. And this is the question that it's not going to be helpful to everybody else here, but just your use of punctuation here, like of backslashes and parentheses. Right. I would love it if you could talk about it, because as I read it, I can tell you what my reader's experience it was like, but I would love to hear what your experience was in designing it in that way.
For me, it is that sometimes I hear multiple possibilities in one moment.
So it's that branching mind again.
It's that branching mind.
Yeah.
And that honestly is how I hear and how language works to me. And so for some of this work, I would write it walking to. I taught in the Bridge to Medicine program at CUNY, at City College. And I lived, after many years, in Harlem. And so it was about a 10-minute walk. And so I would compose as I was walking. And then I'd have to write it down once I got there.
Yeah.
But the thing is that in walking, you're like, well, it could be this, but it could be this. And so that, for me, is it. it ultimately is how I hear and how I even understand the possibilities of grammar and of language.
Right.
Right?
So those for everybody who's listening, the parentheses, backslash are a way of like inserting a word letter that might change the meaning of the sentence, or leaving it out in a way that might. And as a reader, that's exactly. It's almost like hearing a preacher who's like repeating something, like and even that repeating, but with a slight difference that gets you somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
Thank
what it feels
you.
like as your reader.
Well, I'm really relieved and moved that you said this. A part of a master's thesis that will never see the light of day.
Yeah.
Part of the essay for this master's thesis is about the cadences of church for me. And that the repetition and variation is actually an act of creation.
Yeah.
And that it's almost, at times, it's kind of feeling your way through for me. I used to pace when I'd write.
Yeah.
I would read aloud as I have something written, and then I read aloud, and where the tongue trips is where I might say, okay, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so I was actually very scared. I thought people are going to think I'm crazy. Nobody will get why I'm doing this.
No, I completely understood. You know what I liked was, I mean, there's a way in which kind of like in the 1980s and 1990s, postmodern writers would do very clever things with language. But this is not that at all for me. It's like I said, it's a way of almost like getting you to go back and just in the way that we do in conversation. You know, we might ask a clarifying question. We might just show by our face that we don't understand. That's what it felt like. And as I was doing it, I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to hear you read this someday. Do you know what I mean? Because I know you probably have, I mean, maybe it's not meant to be read ever out loud. But.
Well, you know, it's interesting. When, for the book party, John Keane, brilliant, he actually won the National Book Award last year, or the year before, read this book aloud, or read from it aloud.
Yeah.
And I remember, I said, what? And he said, Tonya, there are so many ways you could read this.
Yeah.
And so that was, and it was the repetition. It was the, in moments, a kind of stuttering. But it's also, oddly, I've had in my head a long time the idea of echolocation.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right? How
I talk about
bats
that
find
too.
their way.
I talk about echolocation today in the sermon, and I was inspired by you and did that. I don't usually repeat things, but I did because of you and reading this week. So yeah, I don't know if it'll work or not, but
Of course. Well, it works for memory.
yeah, it does. That's what
Right?
it's for.
That as this is the year of memory, it works for memory.
Yeah.
Right? And memory, like I was just thinking, okay, what can I say about poetry and prayer? And I have a kind of host of things, and I make notes because my brain at the moment is kind of a sieve. And I'll share some of the notes on prayer, but I was thinking about memory. And one of the things, I found this article on where neuroscientists were writing about memory, and writing about memory as chemical and physiological processes.
Yeah.
And also that we talk about technology and external memory, but the external memory has to be incorporated in some way. And so I think, and they talked about memory as dynamic, right? So it is necessarily always changing.
Right, exactly.
Depending on context, depending on, time of day, so many things.
Yeah, so you remember not just the thing that happened, but the times that you remembered it too. And those times that you remembered it are influencing what that memory is. Yeah, it's because it's not like a literal representation of what that's happened.
It's not a literal representation, right?
Back to the metaphors again.
Back to the metaphors and back to poetry.
Yeah.
And also, language is, this last summer from March to the fall, I was misdiagnosed with serious cancer.
Yeah.
And I was not only misdiagnosed, I was operated on for 6 hours. It took them 6 weeks to tell me we did not find cancer.
Oh my gosh.
Then there was an attempt to, I'm laughing because it feels so absurd.
Oh my gosh, it does. It seems like a Camus book.
Right.
Like the plague and the
All
operation.
of it, Kafka, right.
Kafka completely.
And so then the sort of oncology nurse that I went to see afterwards said, well, we never said you had cancer. And I took a breath and I said, well, it's on my medical records,
Right, completely.
which I've downloaded.
Yeah.
And so she goes, oh, wow. But so I had that summer, and I was like, I don't quite know what to say. Like, do I now have the I don't have cancer tour? Like, what's the response?
Yeah.
What does one do? And so I was thinking about that, and the sort of fall started, school starts, and then October 7th happens, and then all these things happen, and I realize in class I don't have the words to speak to what's happening.
Yeah.
And so I begin to think about Bob Kaufman, and I become more and more silent, and I love my friends, but I felt like, the truth is words fail right now.
Yeah.
Because there isn't a way to honestly speak to the horror, the complexity, the awfulness of what's happening.
Yeah.
Without being shut down.
Yeah.
And so I kind of sat with that through a lot of the fall. I mean, I would do a check-in with students.
Yeah.
How are you doing? What are you doing? How are you taking care of each other?
Right.
But that kind of way that language just doesn't always serve us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what do we do?
Yeah, it's so true. So I would love to hear more about just kind of like your pedagogy, like your philosophy of teaching people how to write.
Right.
I think it's like my writing teachers just have opened a whole world for me. I depend on what I learn from them every day.
Right.
And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about how you get a student from someone who can't communicate and help them to be able to communicate in a new way.
I often feel that I try to encourage students to not start from an expectation of mastery.
Yeah.
Right? That I am not the master of the field.
Right.
That in fact, we all have questions and points of entry. And I encourage them to have a sense that we have to be engaged in reading deeply, in reading closely.
Yeah.
That it's an attention to language, attention to the etymologies of words, not so that you know all the stuff.
Right, the dictionary definitions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But so that you're able to play.
Yeah.
And I try to encourage a kind of serious play that that lets them discover ways of thinking they didn't know they had. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Patricia Williams was on the forum, I think a couple of years ago.
Really?
Yeah,
I love her work.
Me too. She's been such an inspiration to me for so long.
Right.
But one of the lasting parts of that conversation for me was just the personal pain she felt about censorship, of having libraries and schools removing her work. It's, the critical race theory conversation. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, our society where we're starting to police that language in a way that seems very different than when I was a young person.
Well, I think it's also about, as we're in this space where there are more and more histories being made apparent, right? Histories from different points of view. This censorship of books becomes about controlling narratives, right? Controlling which voices are spoken of, which grief is spoken of, which joy is spoken of. And that's about controlling thought and controlling how we are with each other.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, I think of San Francisco State and the protests in the 60s to have Black studies there. And in a way, so now we do have Black studies at places like San Francisco State. And now we have a whole part of society which is basically trying to shut down the results of that kind of scholarship.
And it's funny, I almost think it's many aspects of society that are trying to shut it down, because we see how money has been siphoned away from public education.
Right.
Schools are more and more expensive for students, so it becomes increasingly inaccessible. That in New York, I spent a lot of time with Fred Jerome and Jocelyn Jerome, and they were a couple who met during SNCC.
Oh, yeah.
And so Fred wrote on the Einstein files, and Jocelyn was the director of the Bridge to Medicine program at CUNY, which worked to increase the number of doctors who would serve in underserved communities. And so they talked about, like, they would have study groups. Meeting groups growing up.
Yeah, that's what Earth Day is. It was like the study group idea applied to the Earth.
Right. And so now, who has time? If you have to work one full-time job or multiple part-time jobs, who has the time to sort of do this external, this other work? And that it's also, I mean, it's something. I almost feel that that's part of the process of getting us to a place of banning books. It's defunding education so that even when students protest because of what they know, they're punished, they're penalized. And they're told that actually what you know isn't what you should know.
And in response to that, my daughter says, well, why is Yale University investing in companies that make assault weapons? I mean, it's like that simple.
Yes, it is. Well, and don't you think, I mean, those companies have been very strategic in their monies, in where they've placed their monies, the institutes they've built, and what they support.
Anyway, I'm such a downer, but one of our traditions at the...
I am too.
One of our traditions at the forum is we take questions. I know.
Okay.
We take questions from people who might have it. I wanted to ask you this, and this may be a question. If you don't want to answer this question, you have complete permission to skip on to something else.
Okay.
So when I was a young priest, I was 27 years old, Sharon Olds, the poet, her daughter, her mom, was in my congregation.
Really?
Yeah. So
I love her work.
Oh, I know. And Peggy was just an absolutely dear person. I mean, just we loved each other. And what I never asked Sharon, but was there ever kind of like a question in her mind about like, how is what I'm going to write, what effect will that have on people who I love?
All the time.
Yeah, you think that
My
too.
mother has said to me, I will not say stuff in front of you because you're going to put it in a book.
I love that.
I'm
That's
like,
great.
well, yeah, but they don't know
She's already a step ahead
you.
of you.
They don't know you.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, she does. She does say that. And it's funny, too, because I was giving a presentation at some conference, and there was some point in my life I gathered the oldest women I knew, and I filmed them, and they were my two grandmothers when they were still alive. Miss Annie, who knew them both all of their lives, and Cousin Bootsy, who's very profane and made the best crawfish bisque on the planet.
Oh, that sounds so good to me right now.
The best pralines. And so I wanted to film them, and I wanted to ask them, what did I need to know to be a woman in the world?
Yeah.
And I made some pasta stuff and pasta Alfredo. And Miss Annie said, "Oh, you've made something light for us." And I was, "Okay, Miss Annie." And so I was preparing to show some of the video at this presentation, and the technology wouldn't work. And what I felt was, I felt relief.
Yeah.
And I thought, I don't know, y'all.
Yeah,
You shouldn't see this sort of intimate interaction.
Right.
That maybe there can be another sort of move, a way of fictionalizing it.
Right.
But this is not for public consumption.
Yeah.
And so,
But the swarm of bees, by the same token, I mean, you're very courageous in that, in this book, and I think it. I know because different settings have different things, but when you're preaching a sermon, there are moments you kind of take it right to the limit of just like, is this acceptable? Is this, and like you say, it's just like all the people who are in your life become part of the book.
Their voices are a part of my voice.
Yeah.
I mean, I read in the cadences my mother read to me.
Yeah, completely. So here's some of our questions. I'm so glad that I have my glasses. All right. Remembering in mid-1980s on the Columbia campus, I supported opposition to apartheid, yet the protests seemed like a party and those I spoke to didn't listen. I honor free speech and protest. Are the protesters today listening?
This is a good question. My dear friend, who is a professor at the New School but has been attending the encampments at Columbia and other places, one of the things he talked about is, he said, Tonya, he said, the young people are so kind of in it. He said the tough part for him is that if you're encamped on the ground, it's not comfortable. It's not easy.
Right.
And so how does one negotiate between the police coming in, trying to take care of each other, but also being next to people where you're like, damn, you smell.
Yeah, right.
Or, oh, I wish this. And so that's what's hard for him. And I think what he sees, he feels like they're very committed, but what he also feels is that they're going to be broken.
Oh my
and
gosh.
that's the...
That's
the grief for him.
Yeah. So the question goes on. It says, when I talk to many today protesting the horrors of humanity in Palestine, they will not vote. Many say that they are listening to all different viewpoints. All right. Okay, that's that.
Well, it's funny. I think that there are a lot of things that, one, the desperation for things to change on one hand, and feeling like to do the same old in the moment won't, and expect a different result is foolish. That's part of what's thinking. And yet, it's like if the house is on fire, you can't not get the bucket of water you have next to you and try to put the fire out.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot more people will vote than than won't. But I also think there's some way that the narrative about people not voting is a bait and switch, that actually there are all these things in place to prevent people from voting. And so why isn't that the leading sort of news?
Yeah, so
Right?
true.
Why isn't everyone saying, whoa, you see, in this county, in this city, in this place, it's harder and harder for people in these areas to vote?
Yeah.
That's the truth of what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's what will make it harder for people to vote.
Yeah, and the margins are so thin now, I mean, that those votes have a huge impact.
Those have a huge impact. And so there is dishonesty about where the problem is. It's not in, marginalized people who are against brutality.
Yeah.
It's actually in the systematic disenfranchisement of people.
Yeah, gosh, it seems so long. And anything that was before COVID for me is just like in a fog.
Years ago.
But sometime before COVID, we had a Beyonce mass here at Grace Cathedral.
What?
I know, it's just crazy.
What is a Beyonce
So
mass?
a Beyonce mass is basically having all the Beyonce music and people singing along to it and having communion together and dancing and having communion together.
Okay, I love this.
Yeah, like thousands of people upstairs.
Wow.
But I wonder, just Beyonce, the whole bee thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I wondered what ways you see kind of like popular culture kind of informing like literary culture and poetry. Like it has an effect on how we look at the world.
Well, it always has. I mean, I think earlier I mentioned that a poem doesn't stop a bullet, right? That's Baraka. But given that a poem doesn't stop a bullet, they sure as heck got rid of Poet Laureate of New Jersey because Baraka was Poet Laureate of New Jersey. So the poem does something. And the interacting, Kendrick Lamar, didn't he win the Pulitzer?
Yeah, right, he did.
Right?
Yeah,
he won
my
a
son
Pulitzer.
loves that album,
Yeah. What else? There's a book, Morgan, oh God, my brain, who did the book on Beyonce. Do you remember, Steve? Who did the...
Oh, yeah, Morgan Parker.
Yes, Morgan Parker's book on Beyonce. There are
Do you recommend it?
I do recommend, yes.
Oh, great, I'll check it out of the library.
I do recommend it.
Yeah.
There are things more beautiful than Beyonce.
Yes. There are. I think of Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message is Death, which was astonishing for me. I mean, that 7-minute video that has Kanye's Ultra Light Beam as the soundtrack, and so it operates almost like a music video, but it takes you emotionally, visually through such a range of feelings and reactions that was profound for me, and that it's made up of found footage. And so there are a lot of artists who are not turning away from popular culture. I mean, I think of what Kehinde Wiley does. His Archaeology of Silence at the De Young.
Yeah, that was spectacular.
Spectacular, and yet reaching way back and very present tense, right? And then, I felt various ways about Kehinde's merchandise.
Right.
But then I was at the De Young, and I thought, wow, well, I could never afford one of these, but I can have a bag with that image on it. And what is it to take those images that are suddenly in these rarefied spaces and make them accessible to people in a,
Yeah, I feel so embarrassed because I didn't ask you about this earlier, but I wanted to. But you're right. I mean, a painting that's the size of a wall, I mean, it's massive. And you're right. There's something where you could never, it can't be anywhere else. You can't take it to your house. It doesn't fit in the door.
That's right.
But you're right. That little purse might remind you of what it felt like to be in that presence of that object. But you've done so much thought and work on just kind of the relation between kind of visual experience and poetic experience. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. Like, what are the basic things that we might not know about that whole field of thinking?
Well, I think visual artists are the coolest.
Yeah, me too. They're pretty amazing.
And part of it for me is that kind of physical engagement, that way of making well, also musicians. Musicians are pretty great.
Pretty great too.
Okay. Let's be
Right now,
honest.
by the way, you've got to go upstairs. We've got this 500-foot installation of this thing called 2,000 Dragons.
That's what I've heard
Yeah, so if
by
you
a
can-
tattoo artist.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
So he was here yesterday for the installation of it. So yeah, definitely check it out.
I will.
But yeah, I can imagine that visual experience becomes part of your art.
Well, I also thinking of that sometimes artists give us ways of seeing, right? Give us ways of seeing, whether it's seeing a field of color, of seeing a form, of the possibilities of form, suggests ways of charting movement, that's a kind of remarkable thing. Or see, like the thing about AJ's Love is the Message for me is that the visual connects the way these found images sort of slide into each other or relate to each other. So, and that I would not have necessarily seen or understood the relationship without his kind of mapping it out in these 7 minutes. And so it also gave me, for me, visual art gives me a way of thinking about relationships, finding, I don't know, kind of sitting in the differences, right?
Yeah.
And seeing what that reveals.
I wanted to ask you like what you're working on now. What are your hopes for what you might produce in the future?
I'm finished. I'm working on. I have a manuscript to send to my editor.
Oh, congratulations!
On May 11th. Well, it's
May
kind of
11th.
sketchy, this one, but
So most of the manuscript.
most of the manuscript. So that, but I also
What's the title of the piece?
Thingifications.
Oh yeah, right. I saw that somewhere.
Yeah, and I have
Oh man,
something that is now titled Epistles from Planetary Probation. That allows me to pick up on. I wrote an essay called Parentheticalities for a book on influences.
yeah.
And I realized that, I like your description of the branching mind, that's always operative for me. So I thought, okay, what are the formal strategies in the space of an essay?
Yeah.
That would come up. And so it's this sort of parenthetical thing. And so I think that book is out. Other Influences will be out next year from MIT. And then I really want to, those are the main things, let's say that. And then I think I'm working at the Poetry Center, which the 70-year Poetry Center at San Francisco State, Steve Dickinson and Elise Vaccaro are retiring after 25 years.
Yeah, and then you're working in Mexico too, right?
And the thing at Casa Ojalá in Mexico City, which it's right now. There's the video. We had a 3-hour conversation with Afro-Mexican writers and artists, and the hope for me is that it will reconvene, but it will be African and indigenous Afro-Mexican and indigenous artists in Mexico City, and we'll see what we
and
come
the idea
up
too
with.
is something that's kind of beyond our picture of the nation state.
That's right, and that's a community of, there's a mathematician friend of mine in Paris who writes about the history of math. And so I was telling her I really am interested in non-national spaces, right, that are multilingual, translingual. And she said the thing about math, one of the things about the history of math, is that what she's come to understand through her research, and she speaks Mandarin and various languages, she said is that when, in the records, when people refer to like Hindu math, or Hindi math. She said they're not referring to an identity, they're actually referring to a particular formula or a way of approaching it. And so she said what she's discovered is that there were translingual, multilingual sort of communities of mathematicians sharing information, and not the sense that there was competition.
Right, but adding to a larger project.
Exactly.
Okay, so I can't believe it. It's like our time is. I mean, it just went like
This is
that.
it.
I know. Do you have anything more to tell us just about like what we should be paying attention to out there?
I would love if you told me what I should be paying attention to, actually.
Well, you're going to have a chance to do that because while I'm upstairs writing the sermon, people are going to come talk to you about what you said so far today.
Okay. Yes.
Well, I'm so grateful. It makes me so happy to think of you. I mean, those students are so fortunate to have you as their teacher. And
I'm so lucky to be with them. I mean, I'm honestly amazed. I'm amazed by them.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
What a gift. And so next week, we're going to be having as our forum guest Sarah Ogilvie. So you may remember her. That was Jane Shaw's spouse. She's going to be talking about her book, The Dictionary People, An Extraordinary Story About the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary. And I've read it. It's fascinating.
Wow.
Do you remember The Professor and the Madman? It was a book around like the turn of 2000. It's like that, but way better. You're welcome to join us for the Choral Eucharist at 11 o'clock, and we rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. And keep your eyes open for Tonya's next books and for A Swarm of Bees in High Court. And thank you so much, Tonya. We're so grateful to have you here today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.